The mansion was dark in a way that felt deliberate, like a stage waiting for its final act. Evelyn Hart stood in the center of the foyer, heels abandoned somewhere behind her, bare feet pressed against cold marble. The chandelier above her remained unlit. So did the sconces along the curved staircase. The only glow in the entire house came from the screen in her hand. 30 missed calls, husband. The phone vibrated again, sharp and impatient. Mark. She didn't move. Beyond the wall of glass, the ocean rolled under a moonless sky, steady and indifferent. Waves broke against the shore below the cliffside property she had purchased years before she ever met him, long before she believed in merging futures. The phone buzzed again. 31. Evelyn turned the screen face down on the console table, silencing the glow. For a moment, she simply listened, to the faint hum of the climate system, to the distant rhythm of the sea, to her own breathing. Calm, measured, controlled. They thought she was fragile. They thought her silence meant surrender. They had mistaken composure for compliance. 10 years earlier, when Mark's construction firm had been hemorrhaging money from failed contracts and reckless expansion, Evelyn had stepped in without hesitation. She had taken on double the projects at her architecture firm, stayed in offices past midnight, redrawn entire proposals herself to secure investors. She had refinanced her own assets to keep his company solvent. She had visited Eleanor in rehab after the stroke, every week without fail, while Mark claimed he was handling the financial side. And through 10 failed IVF cycles, she had endured hormone injections, surgeries, whispered pity from doctors who avoided eye contact. She had endured the colder pity from her mother-in-law, who never quite hid her disappointment. Evelyn had carried the weight of 3 lives on her back and called it love. Now she walked toward the den, her movements unhurried. The security panel glowed softly when she entered her code. A grid of camera feeds filled the screen. Driveway, kitchen, hallway, library. Her thumb hovered, then pressed library. The image sharpened. Mark sat in a leather chair near the fireplace, bourbon in hand, tie loosened. Eleanor occupied the armchair across from him, posture upright despite her cane resting nearby. The lighting was warm, intimate, almost conspiratorial. They didn't know the audio was active. "She thinks tomorrow is about her," Mark said, swirling his drink. "It's almost sweet." Eleanor's laugh was brittle. "Sweet women are easy to manage." Mark leaned forward. "She'll sign the post-nup. I framed it as estate planning. Responsible, mature." He smirked. "She hates conflict. She'll fold." Eleanor adjusted her scarf, eyes glittering. "And once she signs, the beach house is secured?" "Yes, the agreement overrides community claims. With the post-nup in place, equitable distribution won't touch it, becomes leverage for the refinancing. We clear the corporate debt before filing." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And the heir?" Mark's expression shifted. Pride, possession. "She's pregnant. 12 weeks. It's a boy." Silence followed, heavy with meaning. "A son," Eleanor whispered. Finally, Mark raised his glass. "To Evelyn's last useful contribution, making this easy." Their laughter echoed softly through the speakers. Evelyn didn't flinch. The confirmation felt clinical, like reviewing flawed blueprints. Structural weaknesses revealed, load-bearing lies exposed. Her phone vibrated again somewhere behind her. 32 missed calls now. She ignored it. Instead, she opened a secure folder on her device. Months of quiet preparation unfolded in neat digital rows. Financial statements showing diverted funds, email chains linking Mark to unauthorized use of her architectural designs in a federal bid submission, draft copies of the postnuptial agreement highlighting clauses that attempted to reclassify her premarital property. She had read every line. She had consulted counsel before he ever presented it to her. 3 months ago, she had transferred the beach house into an irrevocable trust, one structured under state law so that neither spouse retained control once executed. The trustee was independent. The beneficiary, upon her death, was a charitable foundation for women in architecture. Mark's name appeared nowhere. She had signed those documents in a quiet office overlooking the harbor long before tonight. Another tap on her screen. Backup complete. Then forward to Dana Ruiz, escort. Delivered. On the camera feed, Mark stood to refill his drink. Eleanor's silhouette sharpened against the firelight. They looked comfortable, victorious. Evelyn watched for one more heartbeat. Then she shut the monitor off. Darkness returned to the den. She walked back into the foyer, the ocean visible beyond the glass like an endless horizon she had forgotten she owned. The phone vibrated again. 33 missed calls. This time she picked it up, not to answer, but to switch it to silent. Tomorrow night, there would be a birthday party. Important clients. Investors. Champagne poured into crystal flutes. Mark playing the devoted husband. Eleanor offering a speech about legacy and lineage. A velvet box would be placed in her hands. Inside, instead of diamonds, there would be a pen. They would call it celebration. They would call it protection. They would call it love. Evelyn walked toward the staircase, spine straight, expression unreadable. They believed they were orchestrating her exit. What they didn't understand was that she had already rewritten the ending. And tomorrow, when the room was full and the lights were bright, she would let them finish their performance. Right before she took the stage and dismantled their empire, piece by piece, in front of everyone who mattered. Evelyn had not always lived in houses that echoed. There was a time when her life was loud, construction sites at dawn, steel beams groaning into place, foremen shouting measurements over the wind. At 35, she had already earned a reputation for seeing structures where others saw chaos. Investors trusted her. City planners respected her. Her name had begun to appear in trade publications beneath headlines that used words like visionary and uncompromising. Mark entered her life during a zoning dispute. He was charismatic in a way that felt unstudied. Broad shoulders, confident stride, the kind of handshake that lingered just long enough to imply alliance. His construction firm had won a mid-sized municipal contract, but lacked the architectural refinement the city demanded. Evelyn's firm was brought in to polish the edges. They worked late that week, drafting revisions across a shared conference table. He admired her decisiveness. She admired his ambition, or what she thought was ambition. Within a year, they were married. At the time, his company was already under strain, overextended on speculative developments, tied up in litigation over a failed partnership. Mark framed it as temporary turbulence. "Every empire has its lean years," he told her one night, brushing hair from her face. "We just need to outlast the storm." Evelyn believed in weathering storms. What she didn't realize was that she would become the shelter. When creditors began circling, she liquidated part of her investment portfolio to inject capital into his firm. When a bank threatened to pull a line of credit, she used her reputation to secure a renegotiation. She redrew entire proposals overnight to salvage bids Mark had nearly sabotaged with inflated estimates. The first time she signed a personal guarantee tied to his company's debt, she told herself it was partnership. The second time, she told herself it was strategy. By the third, it was survival. At home, another battle was unfolding. Eleanor's stroke came 2 years into the marriage. It left her physically diminished but cognitively intact, sharp, observant, and quietly judgmental. Mark insisted they move her into the guest wing of the beach house temporarily. Temporary became permanent. Evelyn coordinated neurologists, physical therapists, home health aides. She redesigned the downstairs bathroom to be fully accessible. She adjusted her schedule around medication cycles and rehab appointments. She learned how to read the subtle signs of fatigue in Eleanor's posture. Gratitude never came. Instead, there were comments, small, surgical. "You work too much for a woman who wants a family. Stress isn't good for fertility. Some women are meant to build buildings, others are meant to build legacies." The IVF treatments began quietly. Hormone injections at dawn, blood work before client meetings, surgical procedures followed by conference calls from recovery rooms. 10 cycles. 10 times she allowed herself hope. 10 times she watched it dissolve under fluorescent lighting and clinical sympathy. Mark grew distant in increments. First the missed appointments, then the impatience, then the subtle blame. "Maybe we're forcing something that isn't natural," he said once, staring at the ocean instead of at her. Eleanor stopped masking her disappointment altogether. "A marriage without children is incomplete," she remarked over tea as though discussing weather. Evelyn absorbed it all. She worked harder. She streamlined Mark's operations, quietly restructuring vendor contracts to stop the financial bleeding. She negotiated settlements behind the scenes to keep lawsuits from going public. She convinced herself that once stability returned, so would affection. But stability is not the same as loyalty. Looking back now, standing in the dim light of a house she had purchased long before she met them, Evelyn could trace the fault lines. The way Mark deferred major decisions to her, but took credit in public. The way Eleanor praised her efficiency, but never her worth. The way the business began thriving again the same year her body finally stopped responding to treatment. Success returned. Profits climbed. Mark's firm expanded into government bids and luxury developments, their social calendar filled with investors and city officials, and somewhere along the way, Evelyn stopped noticing that every sacrifice had been recorded only in her name. Tonight, the missed calls buzzing in the dark were not about concern. They were about control. They had mistaken endurance for dependency. They had mistaken generosity for naivety. But architects understand something most people don't. When a structure begins to rot from within, you don't patch it, you expose it. And Evelyn had spent the last 3 months doing exactly that. The betrayal did not arrive with shouting. It arrived through a speaker no larger than a coin. 3 weeks earlier, Evelyn had been in her studio reviewing structural calculations when a notification from the home security app appeared. Audio detected. Library. Ordinarily, she would have ignored it. The house had staff during the day. Eleanor often watched television at high volume, but something in the timestamp caught her attention. Mark had told her he was at a late meeting with investors across town. Curiosity, not suspicion, made her tap the feed. The library came into view, fireplace lit, curtains half drawn. Mark stood near the mantel, phone in hand. Eleanor sat nearby. "I'm telling you," Mark said, voice clear through the system. "We can't drag this out. Once she signs, we move." Eleanor's tone was lower, deliberate. "And she suspects nothing?" "She's too busy fixing everything I break," he replied with a short laugh. "That's her talent." Evelyn felt a tightening in her chest, subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor continued. "And the other situation?" Mark hesitated only a second. "Handled. She's 12 weeks. Doctor confirmed it's a boy." The word hung in the air. "Boy." Eleanor exhaled slowly, satisfied. "Then we secure the assets before the announcement. The house must be protected. It was foolish to let her keep it solely in her name." "It won't matter after the postnup," Mark said. "Dana from legal drafted it clean. Reclassification clause, waiver of future claims. Once she signs, the beach property becomes marital. If we file later, equitable distribution splits it, 50% at minimum. And if we refinance first, we drain the equity." Evelyn's hand went cold around her tablet. He continued, casual as ever. "She'll sign at the party, public setting. She won't want to make a scene." Eleanor added, almost thoughtfully, "Frame it as protecting the family legacy. Remind her what she hasn't been able to give." A silence followed. Then Eleanor delivered the sentence that shifted everything. "A woman who cannot produce an heir should at least secure the estate." Evelyn stared at the screen, at the firelight reflecting off polished wood, at the 2 people she had carried through financial ruin and physical illness. Mark laughed softly. "Don't worry. Once the divorce is finalized, she'll get something. A settlement. Enough to keep her comfortable." Comfortable. As if her life were an allowance. The audio cut briefly as Mark moved farther from the camera. When he returned, his voice lowered. "Just make sure you're gracious at the party. We need the investors relaxed. Once the paperwork's signed, everything else is procedural." Eleanor nodded. "And the mistress?" "She knows to stay quiet until we're ready." Mistress. Not a rumor. Not a suspicion. A plan. Evelyn ended the feed. She did not cry. She did not call him. She did not confront Eleanor that night. Instead, she opened a new folder on her encrypted drive and labeled it with one word: documentation. If they believed the postnup would corner her, they had miscalculated the most important variable. Evelyn had spent her entire career designing structures that resisted collapse. Now she would design one they could never penetrate. And she would let them think the birthday party was their stage until the moment she turned it into hers. The invitations had been sent on heavy ivory cardstock, embossed in gold, an evening to celebrate Evelyn. The irony was almost architectural in its symmetry. By 7 o'clock, the beach house glowed like a jewel against the dark coastline. Valets lined the circular drive. Caterers moved in quiet choreography. A string quartet played near the terrace doors, the music light and refined, designed to signal stability, wealth, permanence. Inside, crystal flutes chimed softly as guests greeted one another. Developers, city officials, 2 venture partners from Mark's latest expansion project, a state procurement consultant whose approval could tilt millions of dollars. Mark moved through the room effortlessly, one hand resting at the small of Evelyn's back whenever someone looked their way. "My brilliant wife," he said more than once. None of this would be possible without her. The phrasing was careful, vague enough to sound generous, specific enough to imply partnership. Evelyn wore black, clean lines, structured shoulders, a dress that suggested both mourning and authority. Her hair fell in soft waves, understated but intentional. If anyone noticed the absence of jewelry on her fingers beyond her wedding band, they did not comment. She smiled when required. She listened when addressed. She thanked guests for coming. From across the room, Eleanor observed like a curator evaluating her collection. A pale silk suit, a cane she rarely needed, but strategically displayed. When certain women approached her to offer birthday congratulations on behalf of Evelyn, Eleanor responded with a smile that never reached her eyes. "It's a blessing," she would say lightly. "Family gatherings are meaningful at this stage of life." At 8:30, Mark tapped a fork against his glass. The room softened into silence. "Friends," he began, arms sliding around Evelyn's waist, "tonight isn't just about celebrating another year, it's about honoring resilience, dedication, partnership." A ripple of approving murmurs. Evelyn's gaze moved calmly across the crowd. She noted who held contracts with Mark's firm, who had pending bids, who looked bored, who looked invested. Mark continued, "When I faced the hardest years of my career, Evelyn stood beside me. She believed in this company when banks didn't." He squeezed her hand for emphasis, "And because of that belief, we're entering a new chapter." He reached toward a side table where a small velvet box waited. Several guests smiled, expecting diamonds. He opened it with theatrical precision. Inside lay a folded document and a fountain pen. A faint pause rippled through the room, confusion masked by polite smiles. Mark chuckled. "Not as glamorous as jewelry, I know, but this is about securing our future." He removed the document and handed it to her. "A postnuptial agreement," he said warmly. "Just good planning, estate structuring, protecting what we've built." The word estate lingered. Eleanor rose slowly from her seat, commanding attention without raising her voice. "In families like ours," she said, addressing the room as much as Evelyn, "legacy matters, stability matters, especially when circumstances change." Her eyes flicked briefly to Evelyn's abdomen before returning to the guests. "A woman who loves her family ensures its continuity." The message was surgical. The room shifted, subtle glances, curious expressions, a few raised brows from those perceptive enough to sense tension beneath the polish. Mark leaned closer, voice low but audible enough for nearby guests. "It's just paperwork, Ev. We'll toast after." A pen was placed gently in her hand. Dozens of eyes watched. The quartet continued playing, though the melody faltered slightly. Evelyn looked down at the document. She recognized every clause, every calculated attempt to reclassify her premarital asset, every waiver embedded beneath legal language designed to sound collaborative. Mark smiled for the crowd. Eleanor waited. They believed the setting would pressure her. They believed spectacle equaled control. Evelyn lifted her gaze from the paper, and instead of signing, she smiled. Not nervously, not defensively, but with the composure of someone who already knew how the evening would end. The silence stretched longer than etiquette allowed. Evelyn held the pen between her fingers, studying it as if it were an unfamiliar instrument. Around her, conversations had dissolved into a low hum of anticipation. Crystal glasses hovered mid-air. The quartet faltered, then stopped altogether. Mark kept his arm around her waist, but his grip tightened, subtle, proprietary. "It's straightforward," he murmured, smiling for the guests. "Just sign on the flagged pages." Evelyn glanced down again at the document, then back up at him. "Of course," she said softly. "Straightforward." Eleanor stepped forward, leaning lightly on her cane. Her voice carried effortlessly across the room. "Evelyn has always been practical," she announced. "That's one of her strengths. She understands that a family's future must be safeguarded, especially when there are gaps." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor continued, unbothered. "Every lineage requires continuity. Assets should serve the bloodline. That is simply tradition." The word bloodline lingered like smoke. Mark cleared his throat lightly, attempting to smooth the tone. "Mother just means long-term planning. We're expanding. government contracts, new developments, structuring matters. Eleanor's gaze settled directly on Evelyn. And sometimes, she added, women must accept that their value is not always measured the way they wish. The room went still. The implication was no longer subtle. A woman without children, a wife who had failed at her primary function, an asset to be repositioned. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, discomfort disguised as polite coughs. One of Mark's investors glanced toward the door, as if calculating the social cost of remaining. Evelyn's face remained composed. She folded the first page of the document neatly over her thumb. "Mrs. Hart," Eleanor pressed, voice now honeyed and sharp at once, "surely you understand that securing the estate benefits everyone. It would be selfish to hesitate." Selfish. The word landed deliberately. Mark leaned closer, whispering through clenched teeth while maintaining his smile. "Don't do this. Not here." Evelyn turned slightly toward him. "Do what?" she asked, almost gently. His jaw tightened. "Embarrass us." Us. As though unity still existed. She looked around the room slowly, making eye contact with several guests. She noticed how many avoided her gaze, how many watched with clinical curiosity. This was the performance they had designed. Public pressure, emotional isolation, a narrative of sacrifice reframed as obligation. Eleanor lifted her chin. "Sign it, Evelyn, for the family." The phrase echoed. For the family. Evelyn straightened her posture, easing out from under Mark's arm. The movement was small, but decisive. The physical separation was impossible to ignore. She placed the pen back inside the velvet box. "I do care about the family," she said evenly. Mark's smile flickered. "And that's precisely why," she continued, voice steady but carrying across the room, "I won't be signing anything tonight." A collective inhale. Eleanor's knuckles whitened around her cane. "Excuse me?" Evelyn's expression did not change. "I've always believed contracts should be reviewed carefully," she said, "especially when they involve reclassifying premarital property under the guise of marital security." Mark's voice dropped its warmth entirely. "Evelyn," she met his eyes calmly, "you're right about one thing," she said. "This evening is about legacy." She stepped away from the center of the room, toward the projection screen set up near the fireplace, the one meant to display curated memories of anniversaries and vacations. Guests turned instinctively to follow her movement. Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Sit down," but Evelyn did not sit. Instead, she reached for the remote, and for the first time that evening, the power dynamic shifted, subtle but irreversible. The remote felt weightless in Evelyn's hand. For a brief second, the room remained suspended between civility and chaos. The projection screen behind her still displayed a looping image of soft ocean waves, the placeholder Mark's assistant had chosen for sentimental effect. "Evelyn," Mark said, his voice no longer warm, "this isn't necessary." She didn't look at him. Instead, she pressed a single button. The ocean vanished. In its place appeared a clean, professional slide. A company ledger excerpt, highlighted in yellow, a date, a transfer amount, a corporate account. The title at the top read, "Hart Construction Discrepancy Summary." A murmur rolled through the room like distant thunder. Mark froze. Eleanor's posture stiffened. Evelyn's voice remained calm, almost instructional. "Since tonight is about transparency and legacy," she said, "I thought we could begin with numbers." Another click. A second slide appeared, side-by-side bank statements. One from Mark's company operating account, the other from a private account registered under a limited liability entity unfamiliar to most of the guests, but very familiar to Mark. The transfers aligned perfectly. Dates, amounts, routing confirmations. "Over the past 18 months," Evelyn continued, "several funds allocated for municipal infrastructure projects were diverted into a shell entity." A sharp intake of breath from one of the procurement consultants near the bar. Mark stepped forward. "This is a misunderstanding." Evelyn finally turned to face him. "No," she said quietly, "it isn't." She clicked again. An email thread filled the screen, Mark's name at the top. Attached, architectural renderings unmistakably designed by Evelyn's firm, complete with embedded metadata showing original authorship. "These designs," she said, addressing the room now, "were submitted under Hart Construction's name for a federal redevelopment bid last quarter." The procurement consultant's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "They are my firm's intellectual property." Mark's composure cracked. "We're married. It's shared work." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Marital property does not nullify federal copyright law. The room grew colder. Another click. This time, the screen displayed a grainy still image from a restaurant security camera. Mark seated across from a younger woman, his hand resting possessively over hers. The timestamp was clear. A final slide appeared beside it, an ultrasound image. 12 weeks. Silence detonated in the room. Eleanor rose abruptly. "This is outrageous." Evelyn's voice remained even. "What's outrageous," she replied, "is attempting to coerce me into signing a postnuptial agreement that reclassifies my premarital beach property, valued at $8.6 million, while you simultaneously plan to announce a pregnancy conceived during our marriage." Gasps were no longer subtle. Mark's face flushed. "You're humiliating us." Evelyn met his gaze without blinking. "No," she corrected. "You humiliated yourselves." She turned back to the audience. For those concerned about legal clarity, she continued, her tone almost clinical. "I have already submitted documentation to federal authorities regarding unauthorized use of copyrighted architectural plans in a government bid. I have also retained counsel to pursue civil remedies." The procurement consultant stepped back slowly, already calculating exposure. "And as for the house," Evelyn added, her final click restoring the screen to a new document, an official trust certificate bearing a state seal. "3 months ago, I transferred the beach property into an irrevocable trust." The room stilled again. Under its terms, neither I nor any spouse may amend, revoke, or claim equitable interest in the asset. She let that sink in. "If I pass away, the property funds a charitable foundation supporting women-owned design firms." Mark stared at the screen as if it had betrayed him personally. "You can't do that without my consent," he said hoarsely. "I purchased the property 5 years before I met you," Evelyn replied. "Separate property remains separate unless voluntarily converted. I chose not to." Eleanor's voice trembled, not with weakness, but with fury. "You planned this." Evelyn's expression softened, just slightly. "I prepared." She lowered the remote. The room no longer belonged to Mark. It belonged to the truth. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt the architecture of her life realigning. Stronger, cleaner, entirely her own. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was calculation. Every investor in the room was now reassessing risk. Every city official was replaying prior conversations with Mark. Every social ally was deciding how quickly to distance themselves. Mark took a step toward Evelyn, his voice low but shaking beneath the surface. "You blindsided me." She regarded him steadily. "You attempted to coerce me into surrendering 8 figures of separate property while committing financial fraud and marital misconduct," she replied. I responded proportionally. A few guests shifted, uncomfortable at the word fraud. Eleanor's composure cracked first. "You ungrateful woman," she hissed. "After everything my son has given you." Evelyn turned slowly toward her. "Your son's company was 1/4 away from bankruptcy when I refinanced my portfolio to keep it solvent," she said calmly. "I personally guaranteed 2 commercial loans. I renegotiated 3 vendor contracts and secured the municipal bridge restoration bid that restored positive cash flow." Her voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. "Everything he has," she finished, "was stabilized by me." Mark's jaw clenched. "That doesn't give you the right to destroy it." "I'm not destroying it," Evelyn replied. "Your financial records will." She stepped closer to him now, lowering her voice so only those nearest could hear, but ensuring enough proximity for the tension to register. "You diverted corporate funds into an entity tied to your personal life," she said. "If those funds were linked to federally backed projects, the exposure extends beyond civil penalties." Mark's face drained of color. Eleanor interjected sharply. "You're exaggerating to frighten people." Evelyn didn't look at her. "I'm clarifying liability." She addressed the room again. "Equitable distribution applies to marital property acquired during the marriage. My beach house was purchased prior to the marriage and never commingled. The trust documentation ensures no spousal claim can attach retroactively." One of the investors quietly checked his phone. Mark took another step forward, desperation creeping into his posture. "You think this protects you?" he said. "Divorce court will dissect everything." Evelyn nodded once. "Yes," she said, "it will." And for the first time, a flicker of something passed across Mark's expression. Fear not of public embarrassment, but of legal exposure. I have already filed a notice of separation with my attorney, she continued. Given documented infidelity and potential financial misconduct, the court will consider fault in spousal determinations where applicable under state law. Eleanor's cane struck the marble floor sharply. You would dismantle your own marriage like this? Evelyn's gaze softened, but her spine remained straight. The marriage was dismantled the moment deception replaced partnership. Mark's voice rose now, composure abandoned. You can't freeze accounts without my authorization. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. I can notify financial institutions of suspected embezzlement, she said, which triggers compliance review and temporary holds pending investigation. He stared at her. You already did. She held his gaze. Yes. Across the room, whispers had grown into quiet strategy sessions. Two of Mark's partners stepped subtly toward the exit. The procurement consultant was already typing rapidly. Eleanor's voice trembled, rage bleeding into disbelief. You're throwing away your status. Evelyn's lips curved faintly. My status was never dependent on your approval. She walked toward the foyer doors and gestured calmly. Security. Two uniformed officers, hired for the evening under the pretense of crowd management, stepped forward from near the entrance. Mark's head snapped toward them. This is my house. Evelyn met his eyes one final time. No, she said evenly, it never was. And in that moment, the illusion of empire cracked. Not from scandal, but from something far more devastating. Control had shifted, irrevocably. The shift was visible, not dramatic, not explosive, but unmistakable. The two security officers approached with professional restraint, their presence firm but non-confrontational, the kind of authority that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. Ma'am, one of them asked Evelyn quietly. She nodded once. Please escort Mr. Hart and Mrs. Whitmore from the premises. Mark stared at her as though she had spoken in a language he no longer recognized. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of performance. Think about what this does to your reputation. Evelyn regarded him steadily. My reputation, she replied, is built on documented excellence and ethical practice. Yours is about to be reviewed by forensic accountants. A murmur, soft but sharp, moved through the guests. Eleanor stepped forward, cane striking the marble with deliberate force. This is our home, she declared. You have no authority to remove us. Evelyn's expression did not change. The property deed lists me as sole owner at time of purchase, she said calmly. The trust documentation lists an independent trustee. You are neither. The security officer addressed Mark with professional neutrality. Sir, we'll need you to come with us. Mark looked around the room, scanning for allies. There were none. The investors avoided eye contact. The procurement consultant had already slipped toward the terrace doors. Even the caterers were pretending to be invisible. Status is powerful until liability enters the room. This is temporary, Mark said, trying to reclaim footing. We'll resolve this privately. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. We will resolve it legally. The officers stepped closer. Mark's composure fractured. You can't throw me out with nothing. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward the foyer. I anticipated your concern, she said evenly. The front doors opened. On the circular drive, beneath the soft exterior lighting, two large black contractor-grade trash bags rested neatly beside a pair of packed suitcases. The symbolism was not accidental. Inside the bags were Mark's personal items from the master suite, clothing, shoes, documents he had left unsecured. Eleanor's belongings had been carefully folded and placed inside separate luggage. No destruction, no theatrics, just removal. Eleanor's face blanched. You went into my room? Evelyn met her stare. It's my house. The finality in her voice silenced further protest. Mark ran a hand through his hair, panic surfacing in small, involuntary gestures. You froze the accounts, he said under his breath. Didn't you? Evelyn did not answer directly. When financial institutions receive credible notice of potential misappropriation tied to active investigations, she said, they implement precautionary safeguards. His silence confirmed the rest. Eleanor's breathing grew shallow, not from physical weakness, but from the realization that control had evaporated. This is vindictive, she whispered. Evelyn's eyes softened, just barely. No, she said quietly. This is corrective. The security officers gestured toward the exit. Mark hesitated one final moment, searching her face for hesitation. He found none. As they stepped outside, the ocean wind carried in through the open doors, lifting the edge of Evelyn's dress slightly. Cool, clean, unburdened, the front gates opened automatically. The trash bags were placed beside the luggage without ceremony. Guests inside the foyer watched in stunned silence as the illusion of dominance exited the property, not in limousines, but under escort. The gates closed. The click of the locking mechanism sounded louder than applause ever could. Inside, the house felt different, lighter. Evelyn turned back toward the remaining guests. Her voice was calm, controlled, unmistakably steady. "Thank you all for attending," she said. "The bar remains open." No one laughed. But no one left immediately either, because what they had just witnessed wasn't chaos, it was consequence. By the time the last guest left, the house had returned to silence. Not the tense, curated silence of earlier that week, but a deeper one. Cleared. Honest. Evelyn stood alone in the foyer again, the marble cool beneath her feet, the scent of lilies already beginning to feel less oppressive. Staff had discreetly cleaned the glasses, extinguished candles, restored the furniture to symmetry. If someone walked in now, they might never guess an empire had fractured here only hours ago. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. Mark, 12 missed calls. Mark, 13, unknown number. She didn't answer. Instead, she slipped on her coat, picked up her keys, and walked out through the glass doors toward the driveway. The ocean wind met her halfway down the steps, carrying salt and something sharper, clarity. Her car engine purred to life. As she drove down the winding coastal road, headlights carving clean lines through the dark, her phone continued lighting up the console beside her. Mark, 21 missed calls. Eleanor, 5 missed calls. Private number. Then a voicemail notification. She let it sit. Another call came through. This time from one of Mark's business partners. She declined it without hesitation. The investigation notice had already been sent. The compliance hold on the corporate accounts would have triggered internal alerts within minutes. Payroll systems would freeze, lines of credit would flag, vendors would begin calling. Consequences travel faster than apologies. Her phone vibrated again. This time she let it ring long enough to read the text preview that followed. Evelyn, we need to talk. The bank flagged everything. They're freezing operating accounts. You've made your point. She exhaled slowly. Not anger. Not triumph, just release. The coastline opened before her, the moon finally breaking through thin clouds and casting silver light across the water. She pulled over at a quiet overlook she had once visited during one of her IVF recovery days, when she had needed air that didn't smell like antiseptic or pity. Her phone rang again. Mark, 30 missed calls. The same number that had once symbolized urgency. Now it symbolized desperation. She opened the voicemail icon at last, pressing play. Mark's voice filled the car. This is insane. The compliance team is asking about fund transfers. They're talking about federal review. You didn't have to escalate it like this. Call me. We can fix this. Fix this. As if this were a misaligned frame or a cracked tile. A second voicemail followed, Eleanor's voice tight and shaken. You've overreacted. The banks are saying we can't access personal accounts either. This affects everyone. Think about what you're doing. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. The accounts were joint. Notification of suspected corporate misconduct often triggered cross-reviews. Risk departments did not distinguish between ego and evidence. They distinguished between clean and compromised. Her phone lit again. Another incoming call. She turned it face down on the passenger seat. The ocean below roared steadily, indifferent to inheritance, to legacy, to lineage. For years, she had mistaken endurance for strength. She had believed that love meant absorbing damage quietly, that loyalty meant silence. But strength was not silence. Strength was documentation, preparation, boundaries. The wind lifted her hair as she stepped out of the car and walked toward the railing overlooking the dark water. The horizon stretched wide and uncontained. Behind her, her phone vibrated once more. Mark, 31 missed calls. She powered it off. The screen went black. For the first time in a decade, there was no one demanding access to her labor, her body, her property, her patience. Only the sound of waves, and the undeniable feeling of something returning to her, something she had not realized she'd lost. Control. Not over him. Not over the narrative. Over herself. Morning arrived without permission. The ocean was pale blue, almost gentle, as if the night had not carried collapse in its wake. Evelyn stood at the edge of the shoreline, heels in one hand, the tide rolling over her bare feet and retreating again. The air was cool, bracing, honest. Behind her, the beach house rose against the cliff, glass and steel in deliberate design. It no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like property. Her property. Her phone remained powered off in her coat pocket. There would be consequences unfolding in boardrooms and legal offices across the city. Compliance officers reviewing transactions, attorneys drafting responses, Mark scrambling to contain fallout that documentation would not allow him to bury. But for this moment, none of that required her attention. She had done what needed to be done. A decade of exhaustion had culminated not in a scream, but in precision. She thought about the first loan she had guaranteed for his company, the nights she had fallen asleep over architectural drafts while Mark celebrated their success at networking dinners, the clinic rooms, the quiet humiliation of whispered advice about motherhood from women who had never signed a personal financial guarantee. She had been told that a woman's power was relational: wife, daughter-in-law, prospective mother. But standing there now, wind moving through her hair, she understood something fundamental. Her power had always been structural. It was in the contracts she read carefully, the assets she purchased before love clouded strategy, the intellectual property she protected, the quiet legal consultations she scheduled without announcing them. Kindness had been her choice. Preparation had been her strength. Behind her, the house lights flicked off automatically as the daylight sensors adjusted. Clean lines, transparent walls, nothing hidden anymore. She turned slightly, studying the horizon. Freedom did not feel explosive, it felt steady. A notification icon would be waiting when she turned her phone back on. Missed calls, likely messages shifting in tone from anger to negotiation, perhaps even apology. But apology without accountability is simply strategy in softer clothing. Evelyn slid her shoes back on and began walking along the shoreline, each step deliberate. The trust was irrevocable, the property insulated, the evidence archived in multiple secure locations. Her attorney already preparing formal filings. Equitable distribution would apply to what had been built during the marriage, not to what she had owned before it. Mark would face what he had attempted to manipulate, and she would face court if necessary with documentation rather than desperation. The waves surged again, stronger this time, splashing higher against her ankles. She smiled, not because she had won, but because she had stopped losing. For years, they had mistaken her restraint for fragility, her patience for dependency, her silence for ignorance. They had believed empire meant dominance. She now understood that empire meant autonomy. Evelyn reached the end of the narrow stretch of beach and turned back toward the house. The sun climbed higher, casting gold across the glass facade. This birthday had not brought diamonds, it had brought clarity. And as she walked back toward the life she would now rebuild on her own terms, one truth settled firmly within her. Never confuse a woman's generosity with surrender. The greatest gift she had given herself was not revenge. It was freedom. There is a quiet myth many women are taught to live by, that endurance is noble, that sacrifice is proof of love, that silence preserves dignity. But this story reveals something deeper. Endurance without boundaries becomes permission. Sacrifice without accountability becomes exploitation. Silence without strategy becomes invisibility. Evelyn did not win because she was louder. She did not win because she was cruel. She won because she prepared. She read what she signed. She protected what she built. She understood the law. She documented the truth. And when the moment came, she chose clarity over comfort. Power is not aggression. Power is informed choice. For many women over 40, life has already tested loyalty, patience, and resilience. Careers have been built quietly. Families have been supported without applause. Assets have been accumulated through discipline, not drama. The question is not whether you are strong. The question is whether you are protecting that strength. Have you ever mistaken loyalty for obligation? Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace while something inside you was breaking? Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that preparation is a form of self-respect? And most importantly, if you were handed a pen in front of a room full of people, would you sign or would you pause? If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. What boundaries have you learned to set later in life? What financial or emotional lessons changed the way you see partnership? Your story might be the blueprint someone else needs. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can say is not, "I endured." It's, "I prepared."